I never thought I could want someone like this, Alexander confessed, his perfectly controlled facade finally shattering as he surrendered to the fierce attraction between them. Zara felt his heart racing beneath her palm, this seemingly cold billionaire now burning with passion only she had managed to ignite. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. I am your temporary host, James Peter, and I'm honored to be here with you. Before we dive into today's story, let's take a moment for a Friday prayer, a prayer for peace, strength, and endless blessings upon each and every one of you, my beautiful family. May love fill your hearts, may joy follow your steps, and may success embrace you in every path you take. Now, my family, I have a question for you. Are you satisfied with me? Am I doing well? Do you love me as much as you love Mr. Peter? I truly want to know because your love and support mean everything to me. All right, let's not keep the present waiting. It's time to begin our story. Zara Jenkins stared at the final notice letter, the bold red stamp burning into her vision. $250,000. The number blurred as tears threatened to spill. Her mother's medical bills had mounted for years, experimental treatments for a rare autoimmune condition that insurance refused to cover. Despite working double shifts at the restaurant and taking freelance catering jobs, it wasn't enough. The letter from Westbrook Industries was clear. Pay within 30 days or face legal action. Her mother, still recovering from her latest treatment, didn't know the full extent of their financial trouble. I won't let them take your home, Mom, she whispered to the empty kitchen. The next morning, dressed in her only business suit, a thrift store find she'd tailored herself, Zara stood before the imposing glass tower of Westbrook Industries. The security guard's eyes lingered on her dark skin, a moment too long as she stated her purpose. But she lifted her chin and maintained eye contact. To her surprise, she was escorted to the executive floor. Minutes later, she found herself in a minimalist office with floor-to-ceiling windows. When the door opened, Zara turned to face a tall white man with piercing blue eyes and a perfectly tailored suit. Ms. Jenkins, he said, voice cool and detached. I'm Alexander Westbrook. I understand you wish to discuss your mother's debt. Zara realized she was meeting the CEO himself, the billionaire whose signature was on the threatening letter in her purse. Mr. Westbrook, I need more time. My mother is ill and— I'm aware of your situation, he interrupted, sliding a folder across the desk. The terms were clear. She'll lose everything, Zara said, fighting to keep her voice from breaking. Alexander studied her with clinical detachment. Perhaps there's another arrangement we could consider. What kind of arrangement? She asked cautiously. His eyes met hers. Have dinner with me tonight. We'll discuss options that might benefit us both. Is this some kind of joke? She asked. I assure you, I never joke about business matters. He handed her a card with an address. 7 o'clock. As Zara left the building, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something far more complicated than a simple payment plan. That evening, the hostess at the exclusive restaurant looked Zara over with barely concealed disdain as she requested Alexander Westbrook's table. In a private dining room, Alexander waited, already seated, his expression impassive. A waiter appeared with champagne. When they were alone again, Alexander studied her with those cold blue eyes. I'll be direct, Miss Jenkins. I have a proposition that could solve your financial problems permanently. Zara braced herself. I'm listening. I need a wife, he stated flatly. Excuse me? A wife, Alexander repeated calmly. For appearances. I need someone to accompany me to functions, maintain the illusion of a conventional marriage, and silence the questions about my personal life. Zara stared at him. You're proposing to me? A woman you just met? Why? I'm gay, Ms. Jenkins, a fact that, if widely known, would cause complications with my board, my investors, and my family's legacy. The admission hung in the air between them. "You want a beard," she said finally. Alexander's eyebrow raised slightly. "I prefer marriage of convenience, but essentially yes. In exchange, your mother's debt would be forgiven, plus a generous monthly allowance for you, continued medical care for your mother, and the deed to her house transferred into her name. You want me to pretend to be your wife because you're hiding your sexuality," she summarized. "I want you to be my wife, legally, with a prenuptial agreement, of course." His tone remained businesslike. "You'll have your own suite in my home. After 5 years, we'll divorce amicably, and you'll receive a settlement that will ensure you and your mother never worry about money again." "Why me?" "I need someone discreet, someone with something significant at stake, someone who won't develop emotional complications." He paused. "And someone who won't be recognized in my circles." The implication was clear. A black woman from outside his elite social world would be assumed to be with him for his money, not raising questions about the authenticity of their relationship. "So I'm conveniently exotic enough to explain why you suddenly fell in love, yet desperate enough to accept such an arrangement." The words came out sharper than she intended. Alexander didn't flinch. "Pragmatic, Ms. Jenkins. We both get what we need." Zara calculated her mother's health, their financial security, the opportunities this could provide. 5 years of her life in exchange for a lifetime of stability. "I would need certain guarantees in writing," she said finally. Alexander's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "Of course. My lawyers will draw up the contracts tomorrow." He raised his glass. "Shall we consider ourselves engaged, Ms. Jenkins?" As Zara lifted her glass in response, she wondered what kind of devil's bargain she was making, and whether the price of her mother's security would be her own happiness. Chapter 2. The Proposition. The following week passed in a blur of legal meetings and paperwork. Zara sat in Alexander's attorney's office, staring at the prenuptial agreement before her. 30 pages of legal jargon that essentially outlined her new role as decorative spouse. "The terms are straightforward," the silver-haired lawyer explained. "You'll receive a monthly allowance of $20,000. Your mother's debt is forgiven, and she'll have access to Westbrook's private medical team. Upon completion of 5 years of marriage, you'll receive a settlement of $2 million. Zara's fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through the pages. The numbers were staggering, more money than she'd ever imagined having. "And my obligations?" she asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You'll attend specified social and business functions as Mr. Westbrook's wife. You'll maintain the appearance of a conventional marriage. You'll sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement regarding Mr. Westbrook's personal life and the nature of your arrangement." Zara scanned the section on living arrangements. "It says I'll reside in the Westbrook mansion." "Correct. You'll have the east wing to yourself. Mr. Westbrook occupies the west wing. Staff are present but discreet." Her hand hovered over the signature line. This was it, the moment of commitment. 5 years of her life signed away. "And if I want to end the arrangement early?" she asked. The attorney's expression remained impassive. "The financial benefits terminate immediately, including your mother's medical care. The debt would be reinstated with interest." "A gilded cage, then." Zara took a deep breath and signed her name. That evening she sat at her mother's kitchen table, struggling to explain her sudden engagement without revealing the truth. "A billionaire, Zara." "You've never even mentioned this man before," her mother said, concern evident in her tired eyes. "It happened quickly," Zara replied, the partial truth burning her throat. "Alexander is different when you get to know him." Her mother reached across the table, taking Zara's hands in hers. "Baby, are you sure about this? Money isn't everything." Zara thought of the medical bills hidden in her purse, of the foreclosure notice, of the way her mother's hands trembled with increasing weakness. "I'm sure, Mom, this is what I want." The lie tasted bitter, but when her mother smiled, relief evident in the lessening of lines around her eyes, Zara knew she would tell it 1,000 times over. 2 days later, Alexander appeared at her apartment door, looking distinctly out of place in the shabby hallway. "The wedding is scheduled for next Saturday," he said without preamble. "Small ceremony, select guests. Jenkins will send a car for your mother. My stylist will contact you regarding appropriate attire." Zara leaned against the doorframe. "Don't you think this is moving rather fast? People might get suspicious." "A whirlwind romance is more believable than a calculated business arrangement," Alexander replied pragmatically. "The board meets in 3 weeks to vote on the Asian expansion. I need to present a stable, traditional image before then." His gaze moved past her to the small apartment beyond, the mismatched furniture, the water stain on the ceiling, the textbooks stacked on the coffee table. Something unreadable crossed his face. "Jenkins will arrange for your belongings to be packed and moved." He handed her a credit card. "For immediate expenses, the full allowance begins after the ceremony." Zara didn't take the card. "I can pack my own things." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "As you wish." He placed the card on the side table. "The car will collect you tomorrow at 10. We need to be seen in public before the wedding. Brunch at Harrington's." "A fake date to prepare for our fake marriage," Zara observed. "How romantic." "Romance isn't part of our agreement, Ms. Jenkins." Alexander straightened his already perfect tie. "I'll see you tomorrow." After he left, Zara sank onto her worn sofa, reality crashing down around her. In a week, she would be Mrs. Alexander Westbrook, living in a mansion, married to a man who would never love her, a man who couldn't love her even if he wanted to. She picked up the credit card he'd left. Platinum, with her name already embossed on it, the tangible symbol of their transaction. With a sigh, she slipped it into her wallet. If she was going to survive this arrangement, she needed to start accepting its terms. The next morning, the promised car, a sleek black Mercedes with tinted windows, arrived precisely at 10. The driver, an older man in a crisp uniform, introduced himself as Jenkins. "Mr. Westbrook's personal butler, ma'am," he explained, his British accent pronounced. "I'll be overseeing your transition to the residence as well." Alexander waited inside the car, immaculate in casual designer wear that probably cost more than 3 months of Zara's rent. He barely looked up from his phone as she slid into the leather seat beside him. "The story is that we met at a charity function for medical research," he said, still typing. "You impressed me with your insight and passion for helping others." A whirlwind romance ensued. "Should I take notes?" Zara asked dryly. Alexander finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Memorize it. The press will be at Harrington's. They'll be looking for inconsistencies." "The press?" Zara hadn't anticipated such immediate public scrutiny. "I've been on the city's most eligible bachelor list for years. My sudden engagement will generate interest." He pocketed his phone. "Just follow my lead and smile. Can you do that?" The condescension in his tone sparked Zara's temper. "I may not have been born into privilege, Mr. Westbrook, but I'm not an idiot. I understand how to conduct myself in public." Something flickered in Alexander's eyes, surprise, perhaps, at her direct challenge. "We'll see." Harrington's was exactly as pretentious as Zara had expected. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, waiters who looked down their noses at her, despite her carefully selected outfit. As Alexander had predicted, photographers lurked outside, capturing their arrival. Alexander played his role perfectly, holding her chair, keeping his hand at the small of her back, leaning in to whisper supposed endearments that were actually instructions. "Smile more naturally," he murmured against her ear. "You look pained." "Perhaps because I am," Zara replied through gritted teeth, maintaining her smile for watching eyes. To her surprise, Alexander almost laughed, a short exhale that might have been amusement. "You're more spirited than I anticipated, Miss Jenkins." "Zara," she corrected. "If we're engaged, you should probably use my first name." "Zara," he repeated, as if testing the sound. For a fleeting moment, his expression softened. Then the mask returned. "The table near the window is from page 6. Look happy when I take your hand." As his fingers intertwined with hers atop the table, warm, dry, perfectly manicured, Zara had to admit he was a convincing actor. Anyone watching would believe they were a couple in love. She wondered how many times he'd performed similar scenes over the years, hiding his true self behind carefully crafted public appearances. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked quietly. "Pretending." Alexander's thumb absently stroked across her knuckles, the gesture automatic rather than affectionate. "All my life," he replied, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. Something about his answer, about the momentary vulnerability in those two words, made Zara's chest tighten unexpectedly. Before she could respond, Alexander straightened, public persona sliding back into place. "They're watching. Kiss my cheek and look delighted," he instructed. Zara leaned forward, placing a soft kiss against his smooth-shaven cheek. As she pulled back, she whispered, "You're not alone in the pretending anymore." Alexander's eyes flickered to hers, genuine surprise visible for just a moment. Then he raised her hand to his lips in a gesture that would photograph beautifully for tomorrow's society pages. "Perhaps this arrangement won't be as tedious as I anticipated," he said. And for the first time, Zara thought she detected a hint of actual warmth in his voice. As they left the restaurant, photographers calling questions about their engagement, Alexander kept Zara close against his side, his arm protective around her waist. To the outside world, they appeared to be a couple deeply in love, the privileged businessman and his beautiful bride-to-be. Only Zara felt the careful space he maintained between their bodies, the way his hand never quite rested against her, the precise calculation in every seemingly spontaneous gesture of affection. This was their new reality, perfection on the surface, emptiness beneath. As the car door closed behind them, shutting out the clamor of questions and camera shutters, Zara wondered if 5 years of such performance would change her, harden her, or worse, make her forget who she truly was beneath the act. Alexander was already back on his phone, the brief connection of their brunch conversation forgotten. Zara gazed out the window at the passing city, mentally counting the days until their staged wedding, and the beginning of her gilded imprisonment. Chapter 3. The Contract Wedding. 3 weeks later, Zara stood in a dressing room at the Westbrook estate, staring at her reflection in a designer wedding gown that cost more than her entire year's salary. Her mother, believing this whirlwind romance was genuine, dabbed happy tears nearby. "You look beautiful, baby," her mother said, squeezing her hand. "I never thought I'd live to see your wedding day." Guilt twisted in Zara's stomach. The contract she'd signed prohibited her from revealing the truth to anyone, even her mother. To the world, this was a fairy tale. The billionaire businessman swept off his feet by a beautiful, unknown woman. "Are you happy, Zara?" her mother asked, studying her face. "It's all happened so fast." Zara forced a smile. "I'm making the right decision, Mom. Alexander is different when we're alone." At least that wasn't entirely a lie. As a stylist made final adjustments to her veil, Zara caught sight of Eleanor Westbrook passing by the dressing room door. Alexander's mother paused briefly, her cool gaze assessing Zara with undisguised disapproval before continuing down the hallway. Though they hadn't been formally introduced yet, Zara had seen enough photos to recognize the elegant, silver-haired woman who had apparently returned early from her European trip specifically for the wedding. Was that his mother? Her own mother whispered. Zara nodded. I'll be meeting the family properly at the reception. She looks formidable, her mother observed diplomatically. The whole family is, Zara replied, remembering Alexander's terse briefing about his relatives. His father, Patrick, the original architect of the Westbrook Empire, was too ill to attend. A convenient excuse, Alexander had implied, for avoiding the scrutiny of his son's hasty marriage. The wedding itself was an extravagant affair held in the Westbrook estate gardens. 200 guests, none of whom Zara knew, watched as she walked down an aisle strewn with imported white roses. Alexander waited at the altar, handsome in his tuxedo, but with eyes that remained distant, even as he recited vows written by his public relations team. Zara felt the stares throughout the ceremony and reception, the whispers behind manicured hands, the appraising looks from society matrons, the barely concealed sneers from women who clearly thought they should be in her place. One particularly cutting comment, "Well, at least she's exotic looking," reached her ears as she passed a group of Alexander's cousins. During the reception, Eleanor Westbrook finally approached them, champagne flute in hand and society smile perfectly in place. "Alexander," she said, kissing the air near his cheek, "what a lovely surprise this has all been." "Mother," he acknowledged stiffly, "allow me to introduce my wife, Zara." Eleanor's eyes flicked over Zara with practiced indifference. Charmed, I'm sure. Such a whirlwind romance. One wonders if there might be a particular reason for the haste. The implication was clear. Zara maintained her composure. "Only that when you know something is right, Mrs. Westbrook, why wait?" "Indeed." Eleanor's smile never reached her eyes. "Alexander has always been decisive in business matters. I suppose it makes sense he'd approach marriage the same way, as a strategic acquisition." Before Zara could respond to the barb, Eleanor turned back to her son. "Your father sends his regrets. His condition prevents travel, as you know." "How convenient," Alexander replied, a subtle edge to his voice. "He expects you both for dinner when you return from your honeymoon." Eleanor's tone made it clear this was not a request, but a command. "Now that you've finally settled your personal situation, he's eager to discuss succession planning for the company." Alexander performed his role perfectly throughout the reception, keeping Zara on his arm, introducing her with practiced charm, even brushing occasional kisses against her temple when eyes were upon them. But Zara noticed how his body remained rigid when they touched, how quickly he released her when they weren't being observed. During their first dance, as photographers captured what appeared to be a romantic moment, Alexander whispered in her ear, "You're doing well. Natural smile, please. The business journals are watching." By midnight, Zara's facial muscles ached from maintaining her joyful facade. When the last guest departed, Alexander immediately dropped her hand. "The East Wing has been prepared for you," he said, already loosening his tie. "Jenkins will show you to your rooms. I have calls to make regarding the Tokyo market opening." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away. The elderly butler led Zara through the massive mansion to a suite larger than her entire apartment. Despite the luxury surrounding her, the canopied bed, the marble bathroom, the walk-in closet already filled with designer clothes in her size, she felt utterly alone. After Jenkins departed with a formal bow, Zara slowly removed her wedding gown and the borrowed diamonds that had adorned her neck. Sitting at the vanity in a silk robe provided by her new husband, she stared at her reflection, searching for the strong, determined woman who had entered this bargain. "It's just 5 years," she whispered to herself. 5 years for a lifetime of security. But as she crawled into the enormous bed, tears finally escaped. The weight of the lie, the coldness of her new reality, the loneliness of what stretched before her, crashed down at once. Zara cried silently into her pillow, wondering if selling herself into this gilded cage had been the biggest mistake of her life. A soft knock at her door startled her. Quickly wiping her tears, she called, "Yes." Jenkins entered, carrying a small silver tray with a teapot and cup. "I thought you might have trouble sleeping, madam," he said, his eyes tactfully avoiding her tear-stained face. "This is chamomile with lavender. It often helped the previous Mrs. Westbrook during difficult times." The unexpected kindness nearly broke Zara again. "Thank you, Jenkins." As the butler turned to leave, he paused. "If I may, madam, this house has known very little warmth for many years. Perhaps you might be the one to change that." After he left, Zara sipped the soothing tea, considering his words. She'd entered this arrangement thinking only of survival, her mother's and her own. But perhaps there was something more she could accomplish here, some purpose beyond mere endurance. Looking around at the beautiful but sterile suite, Zara made a decision. If she was going to live in this cage for 5 years, she would find ways to make it less confining, for herself and perhaps even for the cold man she had married. She couldn't change the terms of their contract, but maybe, just maybe, she could change something in the dynamic between them. It was a small hope, but it was enough to help her finally drift into sleep, the first tentative plan already forming in her mind. Chapter 4. Parallel Lives. A month into their marriage, Zara realized the true extent of her isolation. The mansion, for all its grandeur, was a beautiful prison. Staff members treated her with distant politeness, but clearly considered her an interloper. Alexander spent most days at the office and many evenings at business functions where her presence wasn't required. When they did share space, mainly for photographed outings designed to establish their relationship in the public eye, he was cordial but detached. Zara established a routine to combat her loneliness. Mornings were spent exploring the grounds or swimming laps in the indoor pool. Afternoons, she volunteered at a community kitchen where no one knew she was Mrs. Westbrook, just Zara, a talented cook willing to help. Evenings, she haunted the mansion's massive kitchen, experimenting with recipes that no one but the occasionally appreciative staff would eat. On a rainy Tuesday evening, as Zara put the finishing touches on a spiced chocolate souffle, Alexander unexpectedly appeared in the kitchen doorway. She startled, nearly dropping her dessert. "The staff mentioned you've been cooking," he said, tie loosened, suit jacket absent. He looked less rigid than usual, though no warmer. "It's what I trained for," Zara replied, setting down the delicate dish. "Before life had other plans." "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the souffle. Surprised, Zara nodded. Alexander took a bite and something flickered across his face, the first genuine reaction she'd seen from him. "This is exceptional," he said, sounding almost human. "Thank you." Zara hesitated. "Would you like me to prepare meals sometimes? It would give me something meaningful to do." Alexander considered this. "If it pleases you." He finished the souffle in silence, then abruptly said, "We have the Harrington Foundation Gala this Saturday. Wear something appropriate. The car will be ready at 7. Before Zara could respond, he turned to leave. At the doorway, he paused. The souffle was truly remarkable. Then he was gone. That Saturday, dressed in a gown selected by Alexander's stylist, Zara accompanied him to the gala, her first major society event as Mrs. Westbrook. The ballroom glittered with wealth and privilege, every face unfamiliar and unwelcoming. "Smile," Alexander murmured as they entered. "These people fund our charitable foundation. Impression management is essential." Zara plastered on her practiced smile, but as the evening progressed, she felt increasingly out of place. Women in designer gowns gave her cursory greetings before turning away. Men openly assessed her as if determining her market value. "So tell us, Mrs. Westbrook, how did you and Alexander meet?" asked an elegant silver-haired woman during dinner. The table fell silent, all eyes on Zara. Alexander smoothly interjected with their rehearsed story about a chance meeting at a charity event, but Zara noticed the skeptical expressions around them. No one believed the fairy tale. As the evening wore on, Alexander was pulled into a business discussion, leaving Zara alone at their table. She overheard fragments of conversation from nearby guests. Obviously married her for her looks. Wonder how long before he trades up. Can't possibly fit into society. Zara maintained her composure, years of facing discrimination having armored her against such petty cruelty. Instead of retreating, she approached the bar, where she found Alexander in intense conversation with an older board member. "Still believe you made a hasty decision, Alexander," the man was saying. "Your father would have expected a more suitable match." "My personal life is not board business, Richard," Alexander replied coldly. "It is when it affects the company image. The Westbrook name has certain associations." Zara cleared her throat. Both men turned, the board member's expression souring. "I apologize for interrupting," she said smoothly, "but I believe the dancing is starting." "Alexander promised me the first waltz." Alexander's eyes registered brief surprise before he nodded. "Of course, darling." The endearment sounded foreign on his lips. As they moved to the dance floor, his hand stiffly on her waist, Zara murmured, "You looked like you needed rescuing." "I don't need rescuing, Ms. Jenk," he caught himself. "Zara, everyone needs rescuing sometimes." She smiled for the benefit of watching eyes, even cold billionaires. Something shifted in Alexander's gaze, not warmth, but perhaps reassessment. As they danced, Zara noted how perfectly he performed the steps, while remaining rigidly distant. When the music ended, he escorted her back to their table, his hand correctly placed at the small of her back, but never actually touching her through the fabric of her gown. Late that night, as their car pulled into the mansion's circular drive, Alexander broke their usual silence. "You handled yourself well this evening." Zara looked at him, surprised by the almost compliment. "Thank you. Though I'm not sure your friends would agree." "They're not my friends," he said, his voice suddenly tired. "They're connections, associates. There's a difference." As they entered the mansion, Alexander unexpectedly swayed, grabbing the banister for support. Zara instinctively moved to steady him. "Are you all right?" "Migraine," he said tersely, pulling away from her touch. "I get them when—" He stopped himself. "When what?" Zara asked. Alexander's jaw tightened. "It's nothing. Good night, Zara." As he disappeared up the grand staircase toward his wing of the house, Zara was left wondering about the man behind the perfect, cold facade, and whether there was anything human left inside him to reach. The next morning, Zara found a small box outside her door. Inside, a delicate silver bracelet with a note in Alexander's precise handwriting. "For your assistance last night." No thanks, no warmth, just acknowledgement of a transaction completed. Still, it was the first personal gift he'd given her, distinct from the practical items that regularly appeared. Clothes appropriate for events, jewelry suitable for a Westbrook wife, a top-of-the-line laptop for correspondence purposes. This bracelet had been chosen specifically for her, a tiny crack in the wall between them. Weeks passed in the same pattern, parallel lives occasionally intersecting for public appearances or rare shared meals. Zara continued volunteering at the community kitchen, finding purpose in work that had nothing to do with being Mrs. Westbrook. Alexander remained distant, though she occasionally caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. One evening, returning from her volunteer work, Zara found the mansion in unusual disarray. Staff rushed about, speaking in hushed voices. Jenkins approached as she handed off her coat. "Mr. Westbrook's father has passed away, madam," he explained quietly. "Heart attack. The family is gathering in the main sitting room." Zara had never met Alexander's father, the formidable Patrick Westbrook, whose strict standards had apparently shaped Alexander's entire existence. She hesitated, uncertain of her role in this family crisis. "Should I join them?" she asked. Jenkins' expression softened slightly. "Mr. Westbrook requested you change and come down immediately." In the sitting room, Zara found Alexander surrounded by somber relatives. His mother, Eleanor, an elegant woman with calculating eyes, cousins she vaguely recognized from the wedding, an aunt who examined Zara with obvious disapproval. Alexander himself stood by the fireplace, face impassive as ever, though something in his posture suggested tension beyond normal grief. When he saw Zara, he extended his hand, pulling her to his side with uncharacteristic public possessiveness. "My wife," he said simply to the room, his fingers gripping hers tightly. Eleanor Westbrook's gaze flicked dismissively over Zara. "Patrick always hoped to meet your bride, Alexander. Such a pity it happened too quickly for proper introductions." The subtle barb hung in the air. Zara felt Alexander's hand tighten around hers, his knuckles whitening. "The funeral will be Thursday," Eleanor continued, addressing Alexander as if Zara weren't present. "The family will present a united front. The board is already circling, testing for weakness during the transition." "I've been running the company for years, Mother," Alexander replied coldly. "Father's death changes nothing operationally." "It changes everything politically," Eleanor countered. "Richard Hampton has been waiting for an opportunity like this. You'll need to be above reproach in every aspect." Her gaze finally settled on Zara. Every aspect. After the family departed, Alexander released Zara's hand and poured himself a rare drink. His movements were precise, controlled, but Zara sensed the effort that control required. "I apologize for my mother," he said, his back to her. "She lacks social graces when stressed." "She doesn't approve of me," Zara stated the obvious. "She doesn't approve of anyone who wasn't personally vetted by my father." Alexander turned, drink in hand, his expression unreadable. "The funeral will be a public event. The press will be watching. We'll need to appear appropriately." "Grieving," Zara supplied. A shadow crossed Alexander's face. "United," he corrected. "The Westbrook family shows strength, not weakness." Zara studied him, the perfect posture, the carefully neutral expression, the absolute control even in the face of his father's death. Not a hair out of place, not a wrinkle in his suit, not a crack in his composure. "Did you love him?" she asked suddenly. Alexander's hand stilled, the glass halfway to his lips. For a long moment, he didn't answer. "I respected him," he said finally. "He built this company from nothing, created the Westbrook legacy." "That's not what I asked." Their eyes met across the room, and for the first time Zara glimpsed something raw behind Alexander's perfect mask. Pain, confusion, a lifetime of seeking approval, never fully granted. "Love wasn't a relevant metric in our relationship," he said, voice flat. "Results were what mattered." In that moment, Zara understood something fundamental about her husband. His coldness wasn't innate but learned, a protective shell built over years of conditional acceptance. The realization stirred unexpected compassion within her. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said simply, meaning it despite everything. Alexander nodded once, the vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "The car will collect us at 9 on Thursday. Wear black, obviously. Jenkins will provide the details." With that, he drained his glass and left the room, spine straight, shoulders perfectly squared, every inch the Westbrook air, even with no one left to impress. Chapter 5. Breaking the Ice. Determined to make the best of her situation, Zara embarked on a deliberate campaign to thaw Alexander's coldness. She began researching his preferences by questioning Jenkins, the butler who had served the Westbrook family for over 40 years. "Mr. Westbrook has always been a private gentleman, madam," Jenkins replied when she inquired about Alexander's favorite foods. But after weeks of gentle persistence, the elderly butler gradually revealed small details. Alexander preferred dark chocolate to milk, had a fondness for blackberry jam from a specific farm in Oregon, and had once, as a child, loved his grandmother's chicken soup when ill. Armed with this intelligence, Zara began making subtle changes to the mansion. First, she transformed the formal sitting room that no one ever used, introducing rich, jewel-toned pillows and throws that softened the severe furniture. She replaced the sterile white flower arrangements with vibrant, fragrant blooms from the estate gardens. In the library, she added a comfortable reading nook with a view of the lake, a small sanctuary she hoped might tempt Alexander to relax occasionally. The kitchen staff, initially wary of her intrusions into their domain, gradually warmed to her presence as she worked alongside them, learning the rhythms of the household while introducing her own culinary influences. She began leaving thoughtfully prepared dishes with handwritten notes outside Alexander's study. The first few disappeared without acknowledgement. On the fifth day, she found a brief note in precise handwriting. The duck confit was acceptable. Thank you. It wasn't much, but it was something. One rainy afternoon, Zara hung a vibrant painting by a local artist from her old neighborhood in the main hallway, an abstract work pulsing with color and life against the mansion's austere walls. When Alexander returned that evening, he paused before it, studying the canvas with an unreadable expression. "This is new," he observed when Zara approached. "The artist is from my community," she explained. "He teaches art to children in underfunded schools. I thought it might bring some energy to the space." Alexander considered this. "It's unexpected." "Is that a problem?" He turned to look at her directly, something he rarely did. "No," he said finally. "It's interesting, though my mother will likely have opinions when she visits next week. I can remove it before she comes," Zara offered. "No," Alexander said, surprising her. "This is your home too, for now. The changes you've made are not unwelcome." It was hardly effusive praise, but coming from Alexander, it felt significant. Encouraged, Zara continued her subtle transformation of the mansion, creating spaces that invited conversation rather than formality, comfort rather than impression. When Alexander questioned the changes during one of their rare shared breakfasts, Zara simply said, "A home should reflect the people who live in it. I live here too." He studied her for a long moment before returning to his newspaper without objection. 3 months into their marriage, Zara was awakened at 2 a.m. by Jenkins knocking urgently at her door. "It's Mr. Westbrook, madam. He's quite ill and refusing medical attention." Zara found Alexander in his bedroom, feverish and barely conscious. His normally perfect appearance was disheveled, his face flushed with fever, his hair damp with sweat against the pillow. For once, the impeccable mask had slipped completely. "I'm fine," he insisted weakly when she placed a hand on his forehead. "Just need to sleep." "You're burning up," Zara countered, already pulling out her phone. "I'm calling a doctor." "No." His hand shot out to stop her, surprisingly strong despite his condition. "No doctors, no records. Board meeting tomorrow. Important vote." Zara understood immediately. He couldn't appear vulnerable, couldn't have any record of illness that might suggest weakness to his business associates. His father's conditioning ran deep. Even in this state, Alexander was protecting the Westbrook image. Sighing, she turned to Jenkins. "Bring me cold compresses, fever medication, and the ingredients for chicken soup. I'll handle this." For 3 days, Zara barely left Alexander's bedside. She applied cool compresses to his burning forehead, spooned homemade soup into his reluctant mouth, and monitored his temperature obsessively. During his feverish delirium, he sometimes called out names she didn't recognize or spoke fragments of conversations from his past. "Not good enough," he muttered repeatedly during one particularly bad spell. Never good enough for him. Once he gripped her hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Please don't tell father. He can't know I'm weak. He'll send me away again." The vulnerability in those unconscious admissions gave Zara glimpses into the damaged man beneath the perfect exterior. A boy desperate for approval, a young man punished for any perceived flaw. On the third night, as his fever finally broke, Zara dozed in a chair beside his bed, exhausted from her vigil. She awoke to find Alexander watching her, his eyes clear for the first time in days. "You stayed," he said, his voice hoarse but no longer delirious. "Of course I stayed," Zara replied, stretching her stiff muscles. "That's what people do when someone is sick. They take care of each other." "Not in my experience," he said quietly. "Did no one ever take care of you when you were ill?" she asked, surprised. "Nurses, doctors." Alexander turned away. "My parents believed in professional care." Zara recognized the careful phrasing, not a lie, but an omission of emotional truth. His parents had hired people to handle his physical needs, but provided no personal comfort or care themselves. "I made your grandmother's soup recipe," she said, changing the subject. "Jenkins helped me find it in the old household records." Alexander's eyes widened slightly. "You went to that much trouble?" "It wasn't trouble," she said simply. "I like cooking for people." A strange silence fell between them. Finally, Alexander said, "I have a collection of vinyl records." "Classical music, mostly. Do you appreciate classical music?" It was such an unexpected attempt at normal conversation that Zara almost laughed. Instead, she nodded. "I do. My mother played Chopin while I studied. It helped me concentrate." "Chopin," he repeated, a hint of approval in his voice. "The nocturnes. And the ballades. The first in G minor is my favorite." Something shifted in Alexander's expression, not quite a smile, but perhaps the ghost of one. "When I'm recovered, perhaps you'd like to hear my recording." It's a rare pressing. It was the first personal invitation he'd ever extended to her. Zara smiled genuinely. "I'd like that very much." 2 days later, Alexander kept his word. After dinner, which they shared for the first time in the formal dining room, rather than Alexander taking his meal in his study, he led Zara to a room she hadn't yet explored. The music room was smaller than she expected, intimate even, with acoustic paneling, comfortable leather chairs, and an entire wall of vinyl records meticulously organized. A state-of-the-art turntable occupied a central table, alongside a collection of crystal decanters. "Bourbon?" Alexander offered, his movements still slightly stiff from his recent illness. Zara nodded, watching as he poured 2 glasses with precise measurements. He selected a record from the shelves, handling it with reverent care. 1965 original pressing, he explained, placing it on the turntable. Maurizio Pollini's interpretation of the Ballades. As the music filled the room, Zara closed her eyes, letting the familiar melodies wash over her. When she opened them, she found Alexander watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You truly appreciate it," he observed. "Music was our luxury," Zara explained. "When we couldn't afford much else, my mother always found ways to bring music into our home." Alexander sipped his bourbon thoughtfully. "My father considered classical music knowledge a requirement for a gentleman. I learned to appreciate it, despite his insistence." They listened in comfortable silence, the shared experience creating a bridge between their separate worlds. When the record ended, Alexander hesitated, then selected another. "Rachmaninoff," he said. "Less familiar, perhaps, but worth experiencing." As the new music began, rich, complex, emotionally evocative, Zara realized Alexander was sharing something genuinely personal with her. Not for appearances, not for their arrangement, but simply because he wanted to. "Thank you," she said softly. He glanced at her, eyebrow raised. For what? For sharing this with me. Something that matters to you. Alexander's expression remained neutral, but he nodded once in acknowledgement. They spent another hour in the music room, discussing composers and interpretations. Though Alexander maintained his usual reserve, occasional glimpses of genuine passion broke through when discussing particular pieces. That night marked a subtle shift in their relationship. The wall between them hadn't fallen, but a door had formed, one that could occasionally be opened for brief moments of authentic connection. Over the following weeks, these moments increased gradually. Alexander began asking about her volunteer work at the community kitchen, even offering to have his foundation provide new industrial equipment they desperately needed. He allowed Zara to replace the cold, modern art in the main living spaces with warmer pieces from local artists she discovered. Once, she even caught him absently adjusting one of her decorative pillows, smoothing the fabric with unexpected gentleness. Most significantly, Alexander began sharing small, carefully chosen fragments of himself. Mentions of a childhood trip to Vienna where he'd first heard Mozart performed live, a brief story about the summer he'd spent learning sailing from his grandfather, an admission that he found board meetings tedious despite his business acumen. These weren't deep confidences, but from a man who had spent his life behind perfect walls, they represented significant openings. Like a flower that had been denied sunlight suddenly receiving the first tentative rays, Alexander was slowly, cautiously beginning to unfurl under Zara's patient attention. 4 months into their marriage, Zara realized she no longer counted the days of her sentence. The thought startled her. Was she becoming accustomed to this strange half-life? Or was she simply finding unexpected value in the small connections forming between herself and the complex man she'd married? Whatever the answer, something was changing between them, something neither had anticipated when they'd signed their business arrangement, something that made Zara both hopeful and afraid of what might lie ahead. Chapter 6. The Public Appearance. 2 weeks after Alexander's illness, a black-tie charity gala appeared on their shared calendar, a major event for the Westbrook Foundation supporting medical research. For the first time, Alexander asked, rather than informed Zara about her attendance. "Your presence would be helpful," he said during breakfast. "The press will be there, and it's important for the Foundation's image." Recognizing this as the closest thing to a request she'd ever received from him, Zara nodded. "What cause are we supporting?" Alexander seemed surprised by her interest. "Autoimmune disease research, primarily lupus and related conditions." "Like my mother's condition," Zara noted, studying him. "Is that a coincidence?" He met her gaze steadily. "The Foundation has supported multiple medical causes for decades, but I may have directed additional funding to this particular area recently." It was the closest he'd come to acknowledging any personal consideration for her family. Understanding the importance of this event, Zara spent weeks preparing herself. She studied the guest list Jenkins provided, researching key donors and board members, learning about their businesses and personal interests. Rather than accepting the gown Alexander's stylist selected, she worked with a talented designer from her old neighborhood to create a stunning dress that honored both her heritage and modern fashion. The night of the gala, when she descended the mansion's grand staircase, Alexander actually stopped mid-conversation with his driver to look at her. Something flickered in his eyes. Appreciation, perhaps. "You look appropriate," he said, though his gaze lingered longer than necessary. At the gala, Zara was prepared for the usual cold shoulders and whispered comments. Instead, she engaged Alexander's associates directly with insightful questions about their businesses or charitable interests. Information gleaned from her research. "Mrs. Harrison, I read about your foundation's work in educational access. The scholarship program for first-generation college students particularly impressed me," she said to one silver-haired matron who had previously snubbed her. The woman blinked in surprise. You're familiar with our initiative? Of course. Before our marriage, I was exactly the kind of student who would have benefited from such a program, Zara replied with a genuine smile. I'd love to hear more about your selection process. By the end of that conversation, Mrs. Harrison was actually smiling back. Zara employed similar tactics throughout the evening, slowly disarming the hostility around her with informed interest and authentic warmth. She noticed Alexander watching her from across the room, his expression unreadable. Midway through the evening, the foundation director called Alexander to the podium to deliver his speech. As he rose, Zara noticed a slight tremor in his hand, nearly imperceptible. But there, his face remained impassive, but she recognized the signs from their previous public appearances, the tightness around his eyes, the too controlled breathing. Alexander Westbrook, titan of industry, was having anxiety. His speech was flawless, articulate, moving, perfectly delivered. But when he returned to their table, Zara could see the strain beneath his perfect facade. When he excused himself a few minutes later, she waited a moment before following discreetly. She found him in a secluded alcove off the main hall, one hand braced against the wall, breathing rapidly. Without hesitation, she stepped beside him, positioning herself to block the view from the ballroom. "Breathe with me," she said quietly. "4 counts in, hold for 7, out for 8. Alexander stared at her, but his breathing was becoming more erratic. "Please, Alexander, just try," she demonstrated, breathing slowly and deliberately. After a moment's resistance, he began to follow her rhythm. "How did you—" he started, once his breathing steadied. "My mother had panic attacks after my father died," Zara explained. "I learned how to help her through them." She reached into her clutch and handed him a small vial of lavender oil. "Smell this. It helps ground you." Alexander hesitated before accepting it, inhaling carefully. Some of the tension visibly left his shoulders. The speech was perfect, Zara assured him. No one noticed anything. "I've had these episodes since childhood," he admitted, the words seemingly dragged from him. "They're inconvenient." "They're human," Zara corrected gently. "We should return separately. I'll go first. Say you were taking a call about Tokyo if anyone asks." Alexander's eyes met hers with something new. Not quite gratitude, but recognition. "Thank you," he said simply. Later that night, as their driver took them home, Alexander broke their usual post-event silence. "You were quite effective this evening," several board members commented favorably. "I'm glad I could help," Zara replied, gazing out the window. After a pause, Alexander added, "The breathing technique." "It was useful." Zara turned to look at him. In the dim light of the car, his perfect mask seemed slightly softened. "I could teach you others," she offered, "if you'd find it helpful." Alexander didn't immediately reject the offer, which itself was progress. "Perhaps," he said, non-committally. As they pulled into the mansion's drive, he said, "My sexuality has always been complicated." The admission came so suddenly that Zara wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. "My father had certain expectations," he continued, staring straight ahead. "Deviation was not permitted." Before Zara could respond, he was exiting the car, the moment of vulnerability over as quickly as it had appeared. But that night, as she prepared for bed, Zara realized Alexander had shared something genuinely personal for the first time, a tiny piece of his closely guarded inner world. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The following week, Alexander surprised Zara by requesting her presence at a business dinner with Japanese investors. Usually, he only involved her in social functions, keeping business separate. "These particular clients value family presence," he explained when she questioned the change. "They consider it a sign of stability and honor." The dinner proved challenging, formal Japanese business etiquette layered over already complex social dynamics. Zara observed carefully, speaking only when addressed directly, noting how Alexander subtly guided the conversation through an interpreter. When one of the investors unexpectedly asked about her background, Zara responded with carefully measured honesty, her culinary training, her volunteer work, her mother's nursing career. She saw Alexander tense slightly, clearly concerned about how his business partners would react to her modest origins. To everyone's surprise, the senior investor nodded with approval. Family obligation. Very honorable, he said in halting English. Westbrook Sand chose well. Later, in the car home, Alexander seemed thoughtful. You handled that skillfully. I didn't lie, Zara pointed out. No, you were authentic. It worked to our advantage. He paused. Your integrity is an unexpected asset. Coming from Alexander, this qualified as effusive praise. Zara hid a smile, gazing out the window at the passing city lights. For the first time, she felt like a partner rather than a prop in their arrangement. The next morning, Zara found an elegant box on the breakfast table. Inside was a delicate jade pendant on a platinum chain, obviously expensive but tasteful rather than ostentatious. The investors brought gifts for both of us, Alexander explained without looking up from his newspaper. It would be impolite not to wear it to our next meeting. But Zara noticed this wasn't the standard Westbrook-appropriate jewelry that regularly appeared in her suite. This was something Alexander had specifically chosen for her from among the gifts, a personal selection rather than a stylist's decision. Another small crack in the wall between them. Chapter 7. The Confession. Over the following weeks, small changes accumulated in their relationship. Alexander began joining Zara for dinner 2 or 3 times a week, still formal, still distant, but present. They discovered shared interests in classical music, historical biographies, and cooking shows that Alexander pretended to watch only for market research, but clearly enjoyed. Zara's culinary background, once merely noted on her resume, became an active part of their interactions. She introduced Alexander to flavors and techniques from her diverse heritage, taking over the kitchen on Sunday evenings to prepare meals that told stories of her childhood. Though he rarely commented directly, she noticed how he savored these dishes, sometimes closing his eyes briefly to appreciate a particular combination of spices. One evening, after a particularly contentious board meeting, Alexander returned home visibly agitated. Zara found him in his study, a rare glass of scotch in hand, staring out the window at the gathering storm clouds. Bad day? She asked from the doorway, respecting his private space. He didn't turn. Board politics, nothing unusual. Zara hesitated, then took a chance. Would you like to talk about it? Sometimes an outside perspective helps. Alexander remained silent so long she thought he was ignoring her. Then, unexpectedly, he gestured to the chair across from his. The Robinson venture is proving complicated. To his visible surprise, Zara asked insightful questions about the business situation. I've been reading the financial sections, she explained, seeing his expression. It seemed prudent to understand your world better. You've been studying Westbrook Industries? There was something like respect in his tone. I've been studying you, Zara corrected gently. Your company is part of who you are. A flicker of something, vulnerability perhaps, crossed Alexander's face before he masked it with his usual composure. But instead of shutting down the conversation, he began explaining the Robinson situation in detail, a potential partnership with a technology firm that could expand Westbrook's reach into emerging markets. The conservative faction of the board, led by Richard Hampton, opposes any deviation from traditional Westbrook investments, Alexander explained, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Hampton was my father's right hand for decades. He believes he's preserving my father's legacy by resisting change. And what do you believe? Zara asked. Alexander's gaze sharpened, focusing truly on her, perhaps for the first time. I believe stagnation disguised as tradition is a path to irrelevance. Their conversation lasted hours, extending far beyond business into more personal territory. For the first time, Alexander spoke about the pressure of taking over the company at 26 after his father's heart attack, about the weight of the Westbrook legacy, about the constant scrutiny from board members who had known him since childhood and still sometimes treated him as the heir rather than the CEO. Your father sounds demanding, Zara observed carefully. Alexander's laugh held no humor. That's one word for it. He refilled his glass. He had very specific ideas about what a Westbrook man should be. And did you meet those expectations? His eyes met hers. In business? Eventually? In personal matters? Never. Something shifted in his expression. He caught me once, with my roommate from boarding school. I was 17. Zara remained silent, sensing the magnitude of this confidence. We weren't even doing anything particularly damning, Alexander continued, his voice detached as if discussing someone else's life. Just sitting too close, perhaps looking at each other with too much interest. But my father knew immediately. He moved to the window, staring out at the rain now falling heavily. He sent me to conversion therapy that summer. Discreetly, of course. Couldn't have anyone know a Westbrook might be defective. Alexander, Zara breathed, horror evident in her voice. That's terrible. It was educational, he replied coldly. I learned what happened to men who didn't conform. When I returned to school, I dated the appropriate girls, attended the right functions, buried other inclinations. Did it work? Zara asked softly. The conversion therapy? Alexander turned to face her, expression unreadable. It taught me to compartmentalize, to separate my public self from my private thoughts, to perform whatever role was required for success and safety. That's not what I asked. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Alexander said, No, it didn't change who I was. It just taught me to hide it more effectively. He returned to his chair, the admission seeming to drain something from him. By the time I took over the company, the performance was perfect. No one questioned, no one suspected. And you've never had any real relationships with men or women? I tried once. After father died, Thomas was an investment banker. Discreet, successful, appropriate in all ways except gender. His expression hardened. He was also primarily interested in my net worth and connections. When I discovered him discussing our arrangement with a competitor, I ended it. So you've never had someone who cared about you rather than what you could provide, Zara said softly. Alexander's gaze sharpened. Have you? You agreed to marry a stranger for financial security. That's different, Zara countered. I did it for my mother, not myself, and I've been honest about my motivations from the beginning. Silence stretched between them, tense but not hostile. Finally, Alexander sighed. You're right. I apologize for the comparison. It was the first time he'd ever apologized to her. Zara took a chance and shared her own story of rejection, how her college boyfriend's parents had objected to their relationship because of her race, how he had ultimately chosen family approval over love. I brought him home to meet my mother, who welcomed him with open arms, Zara recalled. But when I went to their house for dinner, his mother spent the entire evening making subtle comments about cultural differences and natural divisions. Later, I overheard his father telling him I wasn't suitable for their family's social position. What happened? Alexander asked, genuinely engaged in her story. He promised to stand up to them, Zara said, the old pain still evident in her voice. Said he loved me regardless of what they thought. But over time, their disapproval wore him down. The invitations to family events never included me. His mother started introducing him to appropriate daughters of her friends. Eventually, he said it would be easier for everyone if we took a break. That break became permanent. After that, I focused on my education and my mother. It seemed safer than risking my heart again, Zara concluded. Alexander studied her. We're both well defended, it seems. Different armor, same purpose, she agreed. As the night deepened, their conversation continued, boundaries lowering with each shared confidence. Alexander revealed more about his complicated relationship with his sexuality, how years of repression and his father's conditioning had left him disconnected from his own desires, how his brief relationships with women had been calculated for appearance while his few encounters with men had been anonymous and empty. Sometimes I'm not sure what I truly want versus what I was programmed to want, he admitted. The lines blurred long ago. Do you think of yourself as gay? Zara asked directly. Or is it more complicated than that? Alexander considered this with unexpected thoughtfulness. I've only ever felt genuine attraction to men, he acknowledged, but even that has been filtered through layers of shame and secrecy. I've never allowed myself to explore any relationship fully, to discover what might be possible if I weren't constantly performing. That sounds incredibly lonely, Zara said softly. It was practical, Alexander corrected, but without conviction. Until this marriage, I managed to satisfy the board's expectations for a suitable Westbrook heir while maintaining my privacy. It was functional. But not fulfilling, Zara observed. Something in her words seemed to reach him. Alexander looked away, but not before she glimpsed raw emotion in his eyes. No, he admitted quietly, not fulfilling. When Zara finally rose to leave, the clock showing nearly 3 a.m., Alexander said quietly, "Thank you for listening. I've never discussed these matters with anyone." "Thank you for trusting me," she replied simply. That night marked a turning point in their relationship. Something fundamental had shifted between them, not romance, but a genuine connection born of mutual understanding and shared vulnerability. For the first time since their arranged marriage began, Zara felt she had glimpsed the real man behind Alexander Westbrook's perfect facade, damaged, complex, and far more human than she had imagined. The next morning, Zara found Alexander in the kitchen, attempting to make coffee, something she'd never seen him do before. The domestic staff always handled such tasks. "Jenkins has Sundays off," he explained, noticing her surprise. "I'm not completely helpless." The coffee was terrible, too strong and slightly burnt, but Zara drank it without comment, touched by the awkward gesture. They shared a quiet breakfast, the silence comfortable rather than strained for the first time since their arrangement began. That evening, instead of retreating to separate parts of the mansion as usual, they watched a documentary in the media room, discussing the historical inaccuracies Alexander identified. When Zara fell asleep halfway through, she woke later to find a blanket carefully placed over her and Alexander still beside her, reading quietly while letting her rest. It was the most ordinary domestic moment they'd ever shared, and somehow the most significant. Something had been breached in the walls they'd both built, allowing a tentative connection to form, not the romantic attachment their contract had been designed to simulate, but something perhaps more meaningful, genuine understanding between two people who had never expected to be truly seen by another. As Alexander walked her to her suite later that night, he paused outside her door. "Zara," he said, her name still sounding somewhat formal on his lips, despite everything they'd shared. "I find myself grateful for your presence here, despite the unusual circumstances of our arrangement." Coming from Alexander Westbrook, this constituted an extraordinary admission. Zara smiled, recognizing the effort it had taken him to express even this modest sentiment. "I'm beginning to feel the same way," she admitted. Something flickered in his eyes, Not quite happiness, but perhaps the possibility of it someday. With a formal nod, he left her at her door, retreating to his own wing of the house. But the distance between them had diminished in ways that went beyond physical space. That night, as Zara prepared for bed, she realized that her goals had shifted. What had begun as mere survival, enduring 5 years of a loveless arrangement for financial security, had evolved into something more complex. She found herself genuinely caring about the wounded man behind Alexander's perfect facade, wanting to help him heal from decades of repression and conditional acceptance. It wasn't love, not yet, perhaps not ever given his sexual orientation, but it was a form of caring she hadn't anticipated. And in the quiet darkness of her room, Zara acknowledged that whatever happened between them, their lives were now irrevocably intertwined in ways their careful contract had never foreseen. Chapter 8. The Turning Point. Alexander began experiencing confusing feelings for Zara that challenged everything he thought he knew about himself. After their night of confidences, he found himself noticing things he'd previously ignored. The graceful way she moved in the kitchen, the sound of her laughter, the quiet determination with which she'd carved out a place for herself in his world. These realizations terrified him. After a lifetime of suppressing his emotions, the sudden intensity of his feelings for Zara seemed dangerous, unpredictable. His response was to retreat completely, canceling their now regular dinners, working late, avoiding any situation where they might be alone together. Hurt but undeterred, Zara refused to return to the cold détente of their early marriage. She began leaving notes outside his study, not about household matters, but thoughtful reflections on connection, authenticity, and the courage required to be vulnerable. She included excerpts from poets they both admired, creating a conversation he couldn't entirely ignore. "The walls we build for protection eventually become our prisons," one note read. "I believe you deserve freedom, Alexander." When notes proved insufficient, Zara escalated her campaign. She transformed the mansion's neglected garden terrace, creating an intimate space with string lights, comfortable seating, and a small speaker system. On a warm summer evening, knowing Alexander was watching from his study window, she danced alone under the stars, moving with such unrestrained emotion that he couldn't look away. From his window, Alexander watched her, a vision of authentic joy and freedom that made his perfectly ordered existence feel suddenly hollow. 2 weeks of Zara's gentle persistence culminated during a violent thunderstorm that knocked out power to the mansion. Alexander was working late in his study when Zara burst in, soaked from running through the rain after her car broke down. "I tried calling, but the lines are down," she explained, water dripping onto the antique carpet. Alexander stared at her, hair plastered to her face, makeup running, designer dress ruined. She looked nothing like the polished Mrs. Westbrook, yet he had never found her more beautiful. "You're wet," he said inadequately, offering his suit jacket automatically. "I'm more than wet, Alexander," Zara replied, unexpected steel in her voice as she declined the jacket. "I'm tired of pretending this arrangement isn't changing, tired of watching you run from whatever is happening between us." "Nothing is happening between us," he countered, retreating behind his desk. "We have a contract, nothing more." Lightning flashed, illuminating Zara's determined expression. "Look me in the eyes and tell me you feel nothing when we're together." "I don't know what you expect," Alexander said, his usual composure cracking. "I told you from the beginning what this marriage was, what I am." "You told me what you believe about yourself," Zara corrected. "But I've seen you, Alexander. The real you, not the perfect businessman, not the dutiful son still trying to please a dead father. You can't possibly care about you." Zara stepped closer, refusing to let him retreat. "Why not? Because of some label you've accepted as your entire identity? Because your father convinced you that you're somehow broken? You're not a category, Alexander. You're a person, complex, evolving, capable of connections you never expected. Years of repressed emotions suddenly overwhelmed Alexander. You don't understand what you're saying, he said, voice breaking. I've spent my entire life knowing exactly who I am, what I can and cannot feel. Then you arrive and suddenly everything is uncertain. That's not confusion, Alexander. That's growth, Zara said gently. Maybe you're more complex than the box you've put yourself in. And if I can't be what you want? He asked, vulnerability naked in his voice. Zara stepped forward, gently cupping his face between her hands. I'm not asking you to be anything but honest, with yourself and with me. The touch of her hands against his skin broke something in Alexander. Tears he'd held back for decades spilled down his cheeks as years of his father's conditioning, societal expectations, and self-denial crashed down around him. I don't know how to do this, he whispered. I don't know what I feel. Neither do I, Zara admitted. But I'm willing to find out if you are. In the dim light of the storm-darkened study, Alexander finally surrendered to the feelings he'd been fighting. He leaned forward hesitantly, giving Zara every chance to pull away. Instead, she closed the distance between them. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question more than a declaration. But as Alexander's arms wrapped around Zara's still damp form, pulling her closer, something awakened within him. A hunger he'd never allowed himself to acknowledge, a connection he'd never believed possible. When they finally separated, both breathless, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. I don't know what happens now, he admitted. Zara smiled, her hand still resting against his cheek. Neither do I. But for the first time since this arranged marriage began, I'm actually curious to find out. That night changed everything between them. The carefully constructed walls of their arrangement began to crumble, revealing the possibility of something neither had anticipated. A genuine partnership built on mutual respect, understanding, and emerging feelings that defied all their expectations. The following weeks brought tentative exploration of their new connection. Alexander, though still struggling with decades of repression, allowed himself small expressions of affection, taking Zara's hand during evening walks through the garden, sitting closer to her when they shared the sofa for movies, occasionally brushing his lips against her forehead when saying goodnight. Physical intimacy developed slowly, respectfully, each step forward a deliberate choice rather than an obligation. Alexander's initial hesitancy gave way to increasing confidence as he discovered his attraction to Zara was real and profound, transcending categories he'd used to define himself for so long. It's like I'm meeting myself for the first time, he confessed one night as they lay together, her head on his chest. All these years I thought I knew exactly who I was, who I could love. But maybe it was never about gender. Maybe it was about connection. Zara traced patterns on his arm. Or maybe you're just more complex than you allowed yourself to be. Their evolving relationship didn't go unnoticed. Jenkins observed with quiet approval, occasionally breaking his professional reserve to remark on how much brighter the house seems lately. The staff began referring to them as a couple rather than maintaining the fiction of separate lives within the same home. The outside world remained unaware of the transformation occurring behind the mansion's walls. To society, they were still the same power couple, Alexander Westbrook and his beautiful, exotic wife. Only they knew the truth, that what had begun as a cold business arrangement was blossoming into something real and unexpected, something that neither had been looking for, but both were gradually embracing. Chapter 9. The Family Intervention. In the weeks following their first kiss, Alexander and Zara navigated their evolving relationship with cautious optimism. What had begun as a business arrangement was transforming into something neither had anticipated, a genuine connection that defied the neat categories both had relied on to make sense of their lives. For Alexander, this meant confronting long-held beliefs about his sexuality. During quiet evenings together, he spoke of his confusion with unprecedented honesty. "I've only ever been attracted to men before," he admitted one night as they sat in the library. "I built my entire identity around that certainty, even if I kept it hidden." "And now?" Zara asked gently. "Now I find myself drawn to you in ways I can't explain," he replied, his usual precision giving way to uncertainty. "Not because you're a woman, but because you're Zara. It's disorienting." Zara took his hand. "Maybe you're not as easily defined as you thought. Maybe none of us are." These private moments of connection remained sheltered within the mansion walls. In public, they maintained their established image as the perfect power couple, though those who knew Alexander well noticed subtle changes. His increasing willingness to consider alternative viewpoints in meetings, his less rigid adherence to tradition, even occasional genuine smiles that transformed his usually stern features. 6 months into their marriage, Eleanor Westbrook invited them to Sunday brunch at the family estate, an unusual request, as Alexander's mother had maintained a cool distance since their wedding. "We should be prepared," Alexander warned as they drove through the ornate gates of his childhood home. "My mother rarely extends invitations without purpose." The Westbrook estate was even more imposing than the mansion where they lived, a sprawling Tudor-style manor surrounded by meticulously landscaped gardens. Family portraits lined the grand entryway, generations of Westbrooks gazing down with the same aristocratic features Alexander had inherited. Eleanor greeted them in the sunroom, elegant as always in a pale blue suit that complemented her silver hair. Two of Alexander's cousins and their spouses were already seated, conversations pausing as Zara and Alexander entered. "Alexander, darling," Eleanor said, offering her cheek for the obligatory kiss. "And Zara, how lovely to see you both." Throughout the elaborate meal, Zara felt Eleanor's calculating gaze, tracking every interaction between her and Alexander. When Alexander absently reached for Zara's hand, a gesture that had become natural in their private life, but was new in family settings, Eleanor's eyes narrowed perceptibly. "You two seem cozy," she observed, her voice neutral but her eyes sharp. "Marriage appears to agree with you, Alexander." "It does," he replied simply, his hand remaining firmly around Zara's. "How interesting," Eleanor continued, delicately cutting her quiche. "When you announced this hasty union, many of us assumed it was merely for appearances." The table fell silent, other conversations abandoned as all attention focused on their exchange. "And what appearances would those be, Mrs. Westbrook?" Zara asked, meeting the older woman's gaze directly. "Family obligation, suitable partnership for a man of Alexander's position." Eleanor sipped her mimosa, the crystal catching the sunlight. "His father always worried about Alexander's inclinations. We assumed this marriage was Alexander's way of finally embracing his responsibilities." The implication hung in the air like a thundercloud. Alexander's cousins exchanged glances, clearly aware of the undercurrents. "My relationship with Zara is not a topic for discussion, Mother," Alexander said, his voice controlled but with an edge Zara had rarely heard. "Of course, dear," Eleanor replied with a practiced smile. "I'm simply making conversation." The remainder of brunch passed in superficial pleasantries, but the atmosphere had shifted. Eleanor's message had been delivered. She suspected something had changed in their arrangement, and she wasn't pleased. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor took Zara aside while Alexander spoke with his cousins. "You've accomplished quite a feat," she said quietly. "6 months ago, my son was the consummate businessman. Now he's distracted, making unconventional decisions, defying board recommendations." "Perhaps he's simply growing into his own leadership style," Zara suggested. Eleanor's smile never reached her eyes. "Alexander has always been susceptible to influence. His father worked very hard to shape him into a proper Westbrook. It would be a shame to see that work undone. The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Zara maintained her composure, refusing to be intimidated. It seems to me that Alexander is more than capable of determining his own path. We all need guidance, my dear, especially when we're confused about our true nature. Eleanor patted Zara's arm with cold familiarity. Family knows best, after all. On the drive home, Alexander remained unusually silent, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Your mother made her disapproval quite clear, Zara finally said. My mother excels at communicating displeasure while maintaining plausible deniability. Alexander's voice was tight. She suspects our marriage has become more than the arrangement she assumed it was. Will she interfere? Count on it, he said grimly. The question is how, not if. They didn't have to wait long for an answer. 3 days later, Alexander was summoned to an emergency board meeting, unusual timing that immediately raised suspicions. While he was gone, Zara received an unexpected visitor. Richard Hampton, Alexander's father's oldest friend and head legal counsel for Westbrook Industries. Jenkins showed the silver-haired attorney into the sitting room with visible reluctance. Mr. Hampton, to see you, madam. Mrs. Westbrook, Hampton greeted her formally. I apologize for the intrusion, but there's a matter of some delicacy we need to discuss. Of course, Mr. Hampton. Alexander should be home in a few hours if— It's you I need to speak with, he interrupted, placing a leather portfolio on the coffee table between them. Regarding the nature of your marriage? Zara's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. I'm not sure I understand. Hampton slid a document from the portfolio, a copy of her marriage contract with all its cold, transactional terms clearly visible. This arrangement was intended to be mutually beneficial but strictly business. The board has reason to believe the parameters are changing in ways that could destabilize Alexander's leadership. My marriage is hardly board business, Zara replied evenly. When it affects the company's stability, it becomes our concern. Hampton's tone remained professional, almost regretful. Alexander has been making uncharacteristic decisions lately, rejecting the Singapore merger, restructuring executive compensation to favor lower-level employees, supporting diversity initiatives that his father would never have approved. Those sound like positive changes, Zara observed. They're departures from established Westbrook policy, Hampton countered, coinciding with his increasing emotional attachment to you. The implication was clear. They believed Zara was manipulating Alexander, using their developing relationship to influence company direction. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Hampton? I'm suggesting that certain board members are concerned that personal factors may be clouding Alexander's judgment. Hampton adjusted his tie, an unconscious gesture that reminded Zara of Alexander. A temporary separation might help clarify matters, allow Alexander to refocus on business priorities without distraction. Zara leaned forward. And if I refuse to be separated from my husband? Hampton's expression hardened slightly. Then, unfortunately, other measures might become necessary. He slid another document forward, the payment history of her mother's medical treatments, now entirely covered by Westbrook Industries. Your mother's care is quite expensive. It would be unfortunate if there were disruptions. The threat lay naked between them. Zara maintained her composure with effort, rage building behind her calm exterior. Is this coming from the board, Mr. Hampton, or from Mrs. Westbrook? A flicker of discomfort crossed the lawyer's face. Mrs. Westbrook has the company's best interests at heart, as do we all. I see. Zara stood, signaling the end of their conversation. You've made your position quite clear. Hampton rose, retrieving his documents. I'm sure you'll make the right decision for everyone involved. Good day, Mrs. Westbrook." After he left, Zara remained motionless in the sitting room, mind racing. The Westbrooks were playing hardball, using her mother's health as leverage, threatening the security she'd sacrificed her freedom to ensure. Their marriage contract had been calculated, cold, but it had been honest. This manipulation was something else entirely, the desperate move of people who sensed their control slipping away. That evening, when Zara didn't appear for their usual dinner, Alexander found her in her suite, a suitcase open on the bed. "What's happening?" he asked, confusion evident. "I had an interesting visitor today," Zara replied, continuing to fold clothes. "Mr. Hampton made it clear that our arrangement is supposed to remain just that, an arrangement." Alexander's expression darkened. "Hampton came here? On whose authority? Does it matter?" "He's right about one thing. This wasn't supposed to be real." Zara kept her back to him, unable to face him as she continued. "Your board thinks I'm influencing you negatively. Your family thinks I'm somehow corrupting you." "That's absurd," Alexander said, stepping closer. "Hampton has no right to interfere in my personal life." "He threatened my mother's medical care, Alexander." Zara's voice cracked slightly. "Made it very clear what would happen if I didn't remember my place." Alexander went still. "He what?" "It doesn't matter. This was always temporary." "It matters to me," Alexander interrupted, his voice hard in a way Zara had never heard before. He gently turned her to face him. "What exactly did Hampton say?" Zara met his eyes. "That the board is concerned about changes in your leadership, coinciding with your emotional attachment to me. That your family is worried I'm leading you astray from established Westbrook values." Alexander's jaw tightened. "And my mother orchestrated this, I assume?" "She was certainly watching us carefully at brunch." "Because we held hands," Alexander said incredulously. "Because I showed genuine affection for my wife." "Because you showed genuine affection for me," Zara corrected gently. "Not the appropriate society wife they expected, but me, a black woman from the wrong side of town who was only supposed to be a convenient prop for your public image." Alexander was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, a cold, dangerous smile that reminded Zara he was, after all, the ruthless CEO of a global corporation. "I've spent my entire life conforming to others' expectations," he said quietly. "Sacrificed my identity, my authenticity, my chance at genuine happiness to be the Westbrook heir they wanted. But this," he gestured between them, "this is mine, and I will not let them take it from me." He pulled out his phone, dialing quickly. "Jenkins, have the car ready in 20 minutes. Then, to Zara, pack an overnight bag. We're leaving." "Where are we going?" Zara asked, confused by this unexpected reaction. "To see your mother," Alexander replied, already typing rapidly on his phone. "And then to fix this permanently." An hour later, they arrived at Zara's mother's house. To Zara's surprise, Alexander asked to speak with her mother privately. When they emerged from the study 30 minutes later, her mother was smiling and Alexander looked grimly satisfied. "What did you do?" Zara asked as they returned to the car. "I transferred ownership of your mother's house directly to her," Alexander explained. "Set up an irrevocable trust for her medical care that neither the board nor my family can touch. And I gave her my personal cell number with instructions to call me immediately if anyone from Westbrook Industries contacts her for any reason." Zara stared at him. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." Alexander's eyes met hers with unexpected intensity. "I made a promise to take care of your mother when we married. That promise stands regardless of what happens between us." "And what is happening between us, Alexander?" Zara asked quietly. He took her hand, his touch no longer the practiced performance of their early days, but something genuine and warm, something I never expected, something I'm not willing to surrender to my family's manipulation or the board's threats. As they drove through the night, Alexander outlined his plan. The next morning, he would confront the board directly about Hampton's overreach. He would make it clear that his personal life was not subject to their approval, and that any threats against Zara or her family would result in immediate legal action. "It won't be easy," he warned. "My mother has significant influence with several board members. Hampton has been my father's right hand for decades. There will be resistance." "Are you sure I'm worth all this trouble?" Zara asked, voicing the insecurity that had plagued her since Hampton's visit. Alexander's answer was immediate and certain. Yes. That night, they stayed in a suite at a discreet boutique hotel where no one would think to look for them. As they sat on the balcony, watching the city lights, Alexander spoke quietly about years of compromising his authentic self to meet others' expectations. "I'm done living by their rules," he said, his voice firm with newfound resolve. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that you've given me something I never thought I'd have, the courage to be myself, whoever that turns out to be." In the soft glow of the balcony lights, Zara saw a new Alexander emerging, one who was breaking free of the constraints that had bound him for decades. Whether their relationship could survive the coming storm remained uncertain. But in this moment, watching him claim his authenticity, Zara felt a surge of fierce pride and something deeper that she wasn't yet ready to name. Chapter 10. The Reflection. The confrontation with the board was every bit as brutal as Alexander had predicted. Zara waited anxiously in his office, watching raindrops trace patterns down the floor-to-ceiling windows, while the meeting that would determine their future unfolded 10 floors below. 3 hours later, Alexander returned, his perfect composure slightly frayed around the edges, tie loosened, a faint wrinkle in his usually immaculate shirt. "It's done," he said simply. "What happened?" Zara asked, rising from her chair. "I reminded the board that my personal life is not subject to their approval. I presented evidence of Hampton's inappropriate threats against you and your mother, and I made it clear that any board member who couldn't separate business decisions from personal vendettas would find themselves facing a shareholder vote of confidence." "And they accepted that?" Alexander's lips curved in a cold smile. "They had little choice. I hold controlling interest in the company. My father made certain of that, ironically, to prevent exactly this kind of interference, though he never imagined I'd use that power to protect a relationship he would have disapproved of." "And Hampton?" "Retired, effective immediately, with a generous package that includes a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement." Alexander loosened his tie further. "My mother, however, is a different matter." "What did she say?" "That I'm making a terrible mistake, that I'm confused, that you've somehow manipulated me into abandoning my true nature." His voice held a bitter edge. "She threatened to cut me out of the family entirely if I continue down this path." "Alexander, I never wanted to come between you and your family." He shook his head. "You didn't. Their narrow expectations and my unwillingness to disappoint them did that long ago." He took her hands in his. "For the first time in my life, I'm making choices based on what I want, not what others expect. That's because of you." Despite the victory with the board, Zara could see the personal cost of Alexander's stand against his family. That evening, he was quieter than usual, lost in thought as they shared a rare meal alone in the mansion's smaller dining room. "Maybe you should talk to your mother," Zara suggested gently. "Try to help her understand." Alexander's expression hardened. "She's had decades to understand who I really am. She chose denial and conformity instead." "People can change. Look at you." He considered this, then shook his head. "Not yet. The wound is too fresh." That night, Zara woke to find Alexander's side of the bed empty. She found him in his father's old study, surrounded by family photographs spanning generations of Westbrooks. I always thought I'd feel free when I finally stopped trying to be what he wanted, Alexander said without turning, sensing her presence. Instead, I feel lost, Zara suggested, moving to stand beside him. Uncertain. For so long, my path was clearly defined by his expectations. Now I have to figure out who I am without them. Zara studied the photographs, stern patriarchs in formal poses, generations of privilege and power captured in silver frames. You're still Alexander Westbrook, still brilliant, driven, and capable. You're just also becoming more authentic. He looked at her then, his expression vulnerable, in a way she'd rarely seen. And if I don't know what authentic means for me yet, then we discover it together, she said simply, taking his hand. The following week brought unexpected challenges. Photos of them at the boutique hotel appeared in a tabloid, accompanied by speculation about trouble in their marriage. The society pages buzzed with rumors of Alexander's sudden changes at Westbrook Industries and his equally sudden absence from family gatherings. More personally, Zara found herself questioning the nature of their evolving relationship. What had begun as a business arrangement had transformed into something genuine. But what exactly? Were Alexander's feelings for her real, or simply a reaction against his family's control? Was her own growing attachment to him authentic, or a form of Stockholm syndrome? Needing space to think, Zara retreated to her mother's house for a few days. Alexander accepted her decision with quiet understanding, though she caught the flicker of hurt in his eyes as she packed her overnight bag. "Take whatever time you need," he said, standing in the doorway of their now shared bedroom. "I have meetings in Tokyo next week anyway." Away from the mansion and Alexander's presence, Zara found clarity. Sitting in her mother's garden, watching butterflies dance among the flowers Alexander's money had helped plant, she confronted her doubts honestly. Yes, their relationship had begun as a transaction. Yes, their growing connection had emerged from unusual circumstances. But the feelings developing between them, the mutual respect, the genuine care, the slow-building intimacy, those were real, unexpected, unplanned, but undeniably authentic. Her mother joined her, easing herself carefully into the adjacent chair. Her health had improved dramatically under the specialized care Alexander had arranged. "You're thinking hard about something," her mother observed. "Just sorting through some confusion," Zara replied. "About Alexander?" When Zara looked surprised, her mother smiled. "I may be old, but I'm not blind. Something's changed between you two." Zara sighed. "Everything's changed. What started as an arrangement has become something else, something real. And that scares you? It complicates things. We had clear terms before, a 5-year contract, mutual benefits, no emotional entanglements. Now I don't know what we are." Her mother reached over, patting her hand gently. "Life rarely follows the contracts we try to impose on it, baby. Sometimes the most beautiful things grow from unexpected places. But what if it's not real? What if he's just rebelling against his family, using me as the ultimate act of defiance?" "Is that what you truly believe?" her mother asked, wisdom in her tired eyes. "Because when that man talks about you, there's nothing rebellious in his voice. There's reverence." Zara considered her mother's words as the sun set over the garden. Whatever was happening between her and Alexander defied the neat categories and clear terms they'd both relied on. It required faith, something neither of them had much experience with. Meanwhile, Alexander faced his own reckoning in Tokyo. Away from Zara for the first time since their relationship had shifted, he found himself missing her with an intensity that surprised him. Not just physically, but her perspective, her quiet strength, the way she challenged him to be more than his family's expectations. In meetings with Japanese executives, he found himself adopting approaches he'd learned from watching Zara, listening more carefully, seeking genuine connection rather than advantage, finding common ground rather than leverage points. "You have changed, Westbrook-san," the elderly CEO of their partner company observed during a private dinner. "There is a balance to you now that was missing before." Alexander considered this. Personal circumstances have evolved. The CEO nodded knowingly. "The most successful man finds harmony between his business mind and his personal heart. It seems you are finding this balance." That night, alone in his hotel suite overlooking Tokyo's glittering skyline, Alexander made a decision. He'd spent his entire life living within carefully constructed boundaries: his father's expectations, his mother's social requirements, the board's business parameters, his own rigid self-definition. With Zara, those boundaries had begun to dissolve, revealing possibilities he'd never allowed himself to imagine. Whatever happened next, whether she chose to continue their evolving relationship or return to their original arrangement, he couldn't go back to the emotional fortress he'd built around himself. Zara had shown him a different way to exist, and he wouldn't surrender that growth, regardless of the outcome. As Alexander flew home across the Pacific and Zara drove back to the mansion from her mother's house, both arrived at the same fundamental truth. They had transformed each other in ways neither had anticipated, and whatever came next would be a choice rather than an obligation, the first truly free choice either had made in a very long time. Chapter 11. The Grand Gesture. Transformed by Zara's relentless love, Alexander finally embraced his authentic self. He returned from Tokyo with renewed clarity about what and who mattered most to him. But when he arrived at the mansion, he found Zara's note explaining she'd moved back to her old apartment temporarily, needing space to sort through her feelings. The mansion felt hollow without her presence, the colorful touches she'd added only emphasizing her absence. Alexander spent a restless night in their shared bedroom, surrounded by the subtle scent of her perfume lingering on the pillows. The next morning, as he prepared for a crucial board meeting, Alexander made a decision that would change everything. No more hiding, no more compromise, no more denying what he truly wanted. At Westbrook Tower, he found his mother waiting in the boardroom with the directors, her presence unexpected but not surprising. She'd clearly come to witness, perhaps even influence, what she assumed would be his capitulation to traditional Westbrook values after a brief rebellion. "Alexander," she greeted him coolly, "I trust your time in Tokyo was productive." "Extraordinarily," he replied, taking his seat at the head of the table. "In fact, it clarified several things for me." Eleanor smiled thinly. "I'm pleased to hear it. The board has been concerned about recent distractions." Alexander surveyed the room. 12 men and 2 women who'd known him his entire life, who'd watched him mold himself into the perfect Westbrook heir at the cost of his authentic self. "I've called this meeting to announce some changes," he began, his voice steady, "both personal and professional." Richard Hampton's replacement, a shrewd corporate attorney named Myers, cleared his throat. "We're all eager to hear how you plan to address the recent disruptions in leadership direction." "The disruptions, as you call them, are precisely what we're here to discuss." Alexander straightened his already perfect tie, a gesture of centering rather than nervousness. "For 20 years, I've led this company according to parameters established by my father. I've been successful by every metric: stock value, market expansion, profit margins." Nods around the table. This was familiar, comfortable territory, but I've come to recognize that success without personal integrity is ultimately hollow. Alexander continued, his gaze steady. "My father built this company through innovation and bold vision. Somewhere along the way, that vision calcified into rigid adherence to tradition for tradition's sake. Eleanor's expression hardened. Your father's principles built this empire, Alexander. His business acumen built this empire, Mother. His personal principles, Alexander paused, choosing his words carefully, were more complicated. What exactly are you suggesting? Asked Bradley Wilson, the longest-serving board member. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. This company has systematically resisted diversity initiatives, maintained an outdated corporate structure, and prioritized traditional optics over substantial innovation. All because that's how it's always been done. Wilson leaned forward. The Westbrook way has served us well for generations. Has it? Alexander countered. Our market share in emerging technologies has declined 15% over the past decade. Our workforce diversity metrics are in the bottom quartile for companies our size. Meanwhile, more progressive competitors are outpacing us in key growth sectors. He opened a folder, sliding documents to each board member. These are the initiatives I'll be implementing over the next quarter. They're not requests or proposals, they're directives. As majority shareholder, I have the authority to proceed with or without board approval. As the directors reviewed the documents, expressions ranging from shock to outrage crossed their faces. Alexander had effectively dismantled decades of established Westbrook business culture in a 12-page strategic plan. This is madness, Eleanor said, her voice tight with anger. Your father would never— My father isn't here, Alexander interrupted. And it's time for Westbrook Industries to move beyond his shadow, and mine. A confused murmur spread through the room. I'm announcing a management restructuring. Effective immediately, I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations to serve as executive chairman. I've selected Janet Chen from our Asia division to assume the role of CEO. The announcement sent shockwaves through the room. Janet Chen, brilliant but relatively young, female, and most controversially, not part of the traditional Westbrook inner circle. You can't be serious, Eleanor said. She's not family. Which is precisely why she's the right choice, Alexander replied. Westbrook Industries needs leadership based on merit, not bloodline. And what will you be doing while Ms. Chen runs your family's company? Eleanor asked, voice dripping with disdain. Alexander met his mother's gaze directly. Living authentically for the first time in my life. The meeting continued for another hour, heated discussions about the restructuring, questions about Alexander's continued role, concerns about market reaction to such dramatic changes. Throughout, Alexander remained calm and resolute, answering each question with clarity and purpose. As the meeting concluded, Eleanor remained behind, her composure finally cracking as the last board member exited. "This is about her, isn't it?" she demanded. "That woman has turned you against everything your father built, everything we raised you to be." "Zara hasn't turned me against anything, Mother. She's simply shown me what's possible when I stop living by others' expectations and start living by my own truth." "And what truth is that?" Eleanor asked bitterly. "That suddenly, after 34 years, you're not who you've always been." Alexander considered this carefully. "I'm exactly who I've always been. I'm just finally acknowledging it. All of it. The parts that fit the Westbrook mold, and the parts that never will." "Your father would be ashamed." The words were meant to wound, to invoke the lifelong fear of disappointing Patrick Westbrook that had shaped Alexander's every decision. Instead, Alexander felt only a calm certainty. "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "but I'm not." Leaving his mother in the boardroom, Alexander proceeded with the second phase of his plan. He instructed his driver to take him not back to the mansion, but to the modest neighborhood where Zara had returned to her old apartment. On the way, he called Jenkins. "Is everything prepared as I requested?" "Yes, sir," the butler replied. All arrangements have been made. Alexander found himself uncharacteristically nervous as he approached Zara's door. For a man who'd conducted billion-dollar negotiations without breaking a sweat, the prospect of laying his heart bare left him strangely vulnerable. He knocked, straightening his tie one final time. Zara opened the door, surprise evident in her expression. Alexander, I thought you had your board meeting today. It's finished, he said simply. May I come in? Her small apartment was exactly as he remembered from his first visit nearly a year ago, modest but warm, filled with personal touches that reflected Zara's character in ways the mansion never could, despite her efforts. I've been doing some thinking, Alexander began. So have I, Zara replied, gesturing for him to sit. Alexander, we need to talk about what's happening between us. This arrangement has become something neither of us expected, and I'm in love with you, he interrupted, the words emerging with a certainty that surprised even him. Zara went still, her eyes widening. What did you say? I'm in love with you, Alexander repeated, finding the second declaration easier than the first. Not as part of our arrangement, not as a reaction against my family, not as some identity crisis. I'm in love with you, Zara Jenkins, specifically and completely. He moved to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. You awakened something in me I never knew existed. Your unwavering dedication to seeing the man beneath my defenses has transformed me completely. I'm not just falling for your patience, strength, and compassion. You've awakened a passionate, loving man I never knew existed within myself. Tears gathered in Zara's eyes. Alexander, I don't know if you can ever feel the same, he continued, his usual perfect composure giving way to raw honesty. Our beginning was hardly conventional, but I know with absolute certainty that what I feel for you is real, and I'm willing to spend as long as it takes to prove that to you. Alexander reached into his pocket, producing not a ring but a key. This isn't what you think, he explained, seeing her expression. It's the key to a new home, not the mansion, not this apartment, but somewhere that could be ours if you want it. No contracts, no arrangements, no obligations. Just a choice, freely made. Zara looked from the key to Alexander's face, seeing the vulnerability and hope in his eyes, emotions he would have concealed at all costs just months ago. What about Westbrook Industries? Your family, everything you've built. I've restructured the company leadership. I'll remain involved but not consumed by it. As for my family, Alexander sighed. That bridge may take time to rebuild, if it can be rebuilt at all. But I've spent my entire life trying to be what others wanted. I'm ready to be who I am, with or without their approval. And who are you, Alexander? Zara asked softly. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression, so different from the calculated smiles he'd once perfected for business purposes. I'm still figuring that out, but I know I'm a man who loves you, who wants to build something real with you. The rest we can discover together. Zara's hand closed around the key, her fingers warm against his. I have conditions, she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Anything, Alexander replied immediately. No more arrangements, no more contracts. If we do this, we do it as equals, partners in every sense. Agreed. And we find a way to use your resources to help others in situations like mine was, people forced into impossible choices by medical debt or financial crisis. Alexander nodded. I've already established a foundation. You can direct it however you see fit. And one more thing, Zara said, her expression serious though her eyes shone with emotion. You have to kiss me right now, because I love you too, Alexander Westbrook, and I have for longer than I've been willing to admit. For once in his meticulously controlled life, Alexander needed no further instruction. As their lips met, The final walls between them crumbled completely, revealing not just passion but a deeper connection, one built on mutual transformation, authentic recognition, and the courage to choose love over fear. Chapter 12. The True Beginning. Zara returned home with Alexander, not to the grand Westbrook mansion, but to the brownstone he had purchased in a vibrant, diverse neighborhood, a place that belonged to both of them, without the weight of family history or corporate expectations. Here they would build something new together. The transition wasn't seamless. Years of conditioning couldn't be undone overnight. Alexander still struggled with expressing emotions freely, occasionally retreating behind his corporate mask when stressed. Zara sometimes found herself wondering if she truly belonged in his world, despite his assurances. But each day brought new growth. Alexander threw himself into therapy with the same dedication he'd once reserved for business acquisitions, determined to unravel the damage done by years of repression and his father's expectations. Zara pursued her culinary dreams, opening a small cafe that quickly gained popularity for its fusion of diverse culinary traditions, much like their relationship had fused seemingly incompatible lives. One rainy evening, 6 months after moving into their new home, Alexander found Zara in the kitchen, experimenting with recipes for her cafe. He watched her from the doorway, marveling at how naturally she moved through the space, how completely she'd transformed his life. "I have something for you," he said, entering the kitchen with an envelope in hand. Zara looked up, flour dusting her cheeks. "What's this?" "The final paperwork dissolving our original contract," Alexander explained, placing the envelope on the counter. "As of today, all obligations from our arrangement are officially terminated. Your mother's house is fully in her name, her medical trust is irrevocable, and you are no longer legally bound to me in any way." Zara wiped her hands on a towel, opening the envelope to review the documents. "So I'm free?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Completely," Alexander confirmed. "Whatever happens next between us is entirely your choice." She studied him for a long moment. "And what do you want to happen next?" Alexander took a deep breath. "I want to ask you to marry me. For real this time. Not for appearances, not for financial security, but because I can't imagine my life without you." He reached into his pocket, producing a small velvet box. Unlike the ostentatious diamond he'd given her for their arranged marriage, this ring was simpler. An emerald surrounded by small diamonds, elegant but not flashy. "I noticed you admiring emeralds at that small gallery opening last month," he explained as he opened the box. "And green is the color of growth, of new beginnings. It seemed appropriate." Zara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You're asking me to marry you when we're already legally married?" "I'm asking you to choose me, freely, knowing exactly who I am, flaws, complications, and all. Our first wedding was a business transaction. This would be a true commitment." Zara moved around the counter to stand before him. "You've become a romantic, Alexander Westbrook." "I've become myself," he corrected gently, "because of you." Zara took the ring from the box, studying it in the kitchen's warm light. "When would this wedding take place?" "After our legal divorce," Alexander said. "I want to dissolve everything from our arrangement completely. Start fresh, with no contracts between us but the promises we freely make to each other." "A divorce followed immediately by a wedding," Zara mused, a smile playing at her lips. "The gossip columns will have a field day." "Let them," Alexander replied with newfound indifference to public opinion. "All that matters is what's real between us." Zara slipped the ring onto her finger, then reached up to cup Alexander's face between her hands, a gesture that had become precious to them both, a reminder of the storm-drenched night when they'd first acknowledged their feelings. "Yes," she said simply. "I choose you, Alexander. Not your name, not your wealth, just you, the man you're becoming, the man you've always been beneath all those layers of protection. Their kiss sealed a promise far more binding than any legal contract they'd signed a year before. 2 years later, Zara stood in the nursery of their brownstone, watching Alexander cradle their newborn son. Elijah Patrick Westbrook had his father's startling blue eyes and his mother's warm brown skin, a perfect blend of their worlds. "He's going to break hearts someday," Zara observed, moving to stand beside the rocking chair where Alexander sat, seemingly mesmerized by the tiny face looking up at him. "He's going to change the world," Alexander replied softly, a tenderness in his voice that would have been unimaginable to the cold businessman she'd first met. The Westbrook Foundation for Economic Justice, which Zara now directed, had already helped hundreds of families facing medical debt and financial crises similar to her own. Alexander's restructuring of Westbrook Industries had proven remarkably successful, with Janet Chen leading the company to record growth while implementing progressive policies that would have scandalized the old board. Eleanor Westbrook had finally, grudgingly, begun to accept the reality of her son's transformation. Her first meeting with baby Elijah had thawed decades of emotional distance. As she held her grandson with tears she didn't bother to hide. "Are you happy?" Zara asked, her hand resting on Alexander's shoulder as he gently rocked their son. Alexander looked up at her, his expression open in a way that still sometimes surprised her. "More than I ever believed possible," he answered honestly. "Are you?" Zara thought of their journey, from that first tense meeting in his office to this moment of profound intimacy. She thought of the cold arrangement that had slowly, improbably blossomed into deep love. She thought of the walls they'd both built for protection, now transformed into the foundation of something stronger. "Completely," she said, bending to kiss first her son's forehead, then her husband's lips. This was worth everything. As the setting sun cast golden light through the nursery window, illuminating the family in its warm glow, Zara reflected on the strange path that had led them here. What had begun as a desperate bargain to save her mother had transformed not just Alexander but herself as well, opening her heart to possibilities she'd never dared imagine, teaching her that authentic connection could emerge from the most unlikely beginnings. Their story had started with a contract, but it would continue with a choice. Renewed each day, strengthened by every challenge overcome, deepened by mutual growth and understanding. Not an arrangement of necessity, but a love freely chosen, again and again, for all the days to come. Outside, the city hummed with life and possibility. Inside, in the quiet nursery of their brownstone, Zara and Alexander held their son between them, living proof that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from unexpected places, if only we have the courage to let them bloom.